ever started a task and then found that it was harder than you'd imagined? Yeah, it's like quite a lot of the tasks in life are like that. And you've been looking already at the story in Nehemiah of them beginning a task, this task of rebuilding the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And certainly in this chapter, we find them getting to the point where it's a little bit harder than they'd expected. So we're going to read this chapter. It's a whole chapter of the book of Nehemiah. It's chapter 4. If you've got a Bible, then you might like to follow along. Now, when Sanballat, I'd say that sounds like the name of a baddie from the beginning, doesn't it? And he is. He's a baddie. When Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry, greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said, in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and the burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yeah, what they're building, if a fox goes up on it, he'll break it down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised." Turn back their taunts upon their own backs, on their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. That's what had been the case for the Jews. Don't cover their guilt, or let their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. So, we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. It says in other translations, the people worked with all their hearts. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, well, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God, and we set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In Judah it was said, "The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall." And our enemies said, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, "You must return to us." Or, if you look at the footnote that oh, well, don't worry, I've got a little bit, okay. I'm reading from a different translation from the one I prepared my message in and discovering one or two slightly different turns of phrase, but the substance is the same. And our enemies said, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, "You must return to us." So, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in the open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, "Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your homes." When our enemies heard that it was known to us, this plot that they had to come and attack, and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. And from that day on, half of my servants worked on the construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall, and those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each laboured on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other, and each of the builders had his sword strapped to his side while he built, and the man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we're separated along the wall, far from one another. Now, in the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we laboured at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. And I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be on guard for us by night, and may labour by day. So neither I, nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes, each kept his weapon at his right hand. You may, in reading that translation, have found a few different turns of phrases, but the thrust of the story is the same. And it's about the wall. It's all about the wall. At that time and place in history, a good city wall was essential. It was basic security. To be without a city wall would be like us today living in a society where there's just no police force at all. No expectation of justice or security. And building these walls was therefore what we might call a keystone project. That red stone up there is the keystone in that arch, and a keystone project is the central project that holds together a great deal beyond itself. And the walls were like that. Sometimes this idea of a keystone is applied in nature as well. In 1995, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone Park in the States in what proved to be just such a keystone project. Soon after the wolves were introduced, the deer that had been grazing everything to oblivion began avoiding the valleys and the gorges, and that enabled aspen and willow and cottonwood trees to grow. The forests that they formed stabilised the riverbanks, and in those forests songbirds flourished and beavers flourished, and the beavers built dams that created pools in which fish and muskrats and otters thrived. The wolves left carrion that attracted eagles and bears. The wolves also killed coyotes, and that led to there being more rabbits and mice, and that led to there being more hawks and foxes. The reintroduction of the wolves had proven to be a keystone project. It was a central thing that held up so much more, a keystone project that led to many, many kinds of life flourishing. The walls in the book of Nehemiah were a keystone project. They were important because they would protect family life, they'd give confidence to invest in the local economy, they'd empower local government, they'd grant dignity to the community, and when you get to chapter 13, you'll see they even enabled Sabbath keeping in a way that hadn't been possible. And I want you to know that when we consider our shared task of building the church, that project is not just an end in itself. It's another keystone project. It doesn't only mean worship and fellowship, it leads to healing. It leads to people discovering their calling. It leads to stronger marriages, more resilient children, an increase in care for the poor, friendship that dispels loneliness, more confident creativity, and study after study has also shown that it leads to longer life. You live longer if you are part of a church. So this chapter is about this keystone project. it shows us that the project is not just about building, it's also about battling. You see, the Jews, they had these enemies. Sanballat, we don't know much about him. He seems to be a military man because we see him talking to the army in Samaria. And then there's Tobiah, the Ammonite, and I couldn't resist. That appears to be the best picture we have of him. That's not true. What we do know about Tobiah is that he came from the tribe of the Ammonites, who didn't all look like that, but he was a foreigner to the people of Israel, but who had married into a noble Jewish family such that those nobles felt an allegiance to him, even though he was opposed to the welfare of Jerusalem. Now, Sanballat and Tobiah, they could have turned and worshipped the Lord Almighty, as so many foreigners in Israel had done, from Rahab to Ruth, from Naaman to Ebed-Melech in the book of Jeremiah. Many such people came into the nation of Israel and turned to worship the Lord Almighty. And Sanballat and Tobiah could have done, but instead they and those with them remained opposed. And this chapter tells the story of Jerusalem's increasing awareness of the possible threat that they posed. At the beginning of the chapter, then, the people are just making a start with the building, and they're scorned, but they get on with the rebuilding. And then the beginnings of success, then closing the breaches to half height, just gets their opponents going that bit more. They make a plan to come and attack, so that the people of Jerusalem ended up posting watchers at all the vulnerable points, and then ended up, as you see this bit right at the end, in a state of constant vigilance. Now here's the thing. Despite the threat that the Jews quite evidently felt, I mean, they couldn't even take their clothes off, that's how threatened they felt, these enemies never actually became violent. It was all words. The battles described in this chapter were not physical clashes that led to bloodshed. The battles here described are rather battles with shame and with weariness and with fear. And while there are no Ammonites threatening us today, we have those same battles with shame and with weariness and with fear. The battle with shame is described very clearly in the first part of the chapter, where Sanballat jeered at the Jews, says in verse 1. And in the prayer that follows, it's clearly got to the heart of the person praying. Nehemiah, we assume, says, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised." They were laughed at, looked down upon. And the truth is that we all work well when we're encouraged, when we're honoured and celebrated, and when we're dishonoured, disdained, ridiculed, laughed at, we tend to retreat. God made us to work, to thrive and to flourish in a context of being honoured and treated with dignity. A little while ago, I was visiting the house of a Nigerian family in the church that I lead in Oxford, and it was just our normal small group in the church, and they didn't know that I was going to be there that evening in their home, and so they were surprised when I turned up. But being Nigerian, they were very pleased indeed that the pastor was in their house. So they got all the chicken out. They made sure that I had more on my plate than I could possibly eat. They made sure that I had any drink that I wanted that was in their possession. They made sure that I knew that they were pleased. It was really obvious that they were pleased. And I felt honoured, which was lovely. But that's not really the point. What followed on from that is that when we then sat down to read our Bibles and pray and worship together, I didn't just think to myself, oh, it's nice to be here amongst brothers and sisters, I can just relax, here I am in my small group. I thought, I've been received as the pastor from whom there is expectation of life. I've been honoured as that, so I'd better be it. And it wasn't a heavy sense of, oh, come on, there's a pressure on you, you've got a job description, you should do this thing. It was that as I was treated in a certain way, honoured and respected for what God's given me to do. We've all got things that God's given us to do, but as I received that, something lifted in me and I became it in greater measure than I otherwise would have been. And I think they were blessed because I rose up on that occasion. And whatever you're called to, and we all have different callings, whatever you're called to, you know that when you're honoured for it, you rise up to it and you give yourself to it. But these people had the opposite. They were disdained, they were jeered at, they were told they were rubbish, they were told they couldn't do it, they were shamed. Except, of course, Sanballat and Tobiah were mistaken in what they said. What they said was actually a lie. When they said, oh, you can't do it, it's going to be rubbish, it was untrue. The Jews did finish the project. And we face this same battle where people have looked down upon us, where people have shamed us. We are tempted to believe lies concerning ourselves, when the truth is that God has made us his honoured children. He has promised to make us fruitful. He has given us a calling, and because he is glorious and we are his children, we are not ashamed. There's a battle with shame to overcome. Second battle that we see in this chapter is a battle with weariness. Verse 10 says, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. Or in the translation you have, it may say the strength of the labourers is giving out. There is so much rubble, we cannot rebuild the wall. Wow. If there was ever a time in our lives when there was a widespread weariness in society, I think that time is now. There is so much weariness around, so many small battles fought and some lost, so much discouragement, so many moments of disorientation, so much hope deferred, let alone infection making its way around our society. There's a weariness in us. Last week I hosted a lunch for pastors from across the city of Oxford, and I have to say the main feeling in the room was one of being bruised and battered. It's just weariness. An accumulation in most cases of small hurts, small disappointments, stresses that had left people bone weary. And then note that what's said in this chapter is again a lie. It's a lie that's based in some sort of truth. There's a weariness, but the lie is, and so you can't finish. Or rather, and so you can't carry on. But that wasn't true. They did finish the project. And in the New Testament, we find God saying, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And that leads the Apostle Paul to say in response, I will boast about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. See, that the weariness is real, but it's not the end. We need to battle the lie that in our weariness, God's grace is insufficient. Weariness is a liar. At the gym, I often feel that I cannot finish the exercise that I'm doing. Most times, in fact. I'm hugely grateful for the numbers on the screens on the machines, because at the moment that I think I cannot possibly continue and finish this exercise, the numbers tell me that I'm only about halfway through what I did complete last week. The weary body is one thing, the lie is another. The lie that says you can't keep going, you can't carry on, you're too weak, it's too much. The truth is that God has a power that comes and is made perfect in our weakness. That's a battle for us. The third battle in the chapter is one with fear. And how would you feel if your fellow church members who lived nearest to the source of threat came and told you 10 times over, they're going to attack, give up, it's awful, no, stop? That was the challenge. Sanballat and Tobiah and the others had plotted to attack, and the news of that came to Jerusalem, and it was a threat that could inspire fear. Of course, no attack ever came, but the threat contained a temptation, and the temptation was to give up on the project, give up on that keystone project in order to make things okay. That's the temptation. Just give up to make things okay. But if they'd given up, things would not have been okay. They would have remained vulnerable, the economy would not have thrived, there would have been all kinds of danger. It was right for them to keep going. And praise God, they did keep going. And it's clear from this chapter that what enabled them to keep on building was the conviction that God is great and awesome. It's there in verse 14. God is great. I've lost track of where I'm at. I had all of these slides about battles. There we go. And in verse 20, the conviction that God would do... Here we go. That's where I'm trying to get to. Verse 20, our God will fight for us. These convictions that whatever anyone else is saying, and however I feel, whatever anxieties I have, because God is great and awesome and fights for us, I can keep building in the face of shame and weakness and threat. So I'm coming into land here. Have you been shamed or belittled? Sometimes, those words from others, they don't just roll off us. Sometimes they get stuck. And it's not just that someone else has spoken shaming words or that someone else has belittled us, but we are shamed. And we have been belittled, we've been made smaller somehow by their words. Has that happened to you? Are you weary? Exhausted, even? Do you feel threatened? Do you suffer from low self-esteem or low energy or from anxiety? These are the battles we fight. These are the battles we fight, and these are the battles that cause us to give up. Cause us to give up on all sorts of things, but in this series where you're looking at building up God's people, one thing that we must know they cause us to give up on the keystone project of building up the local church community with all of the healing and the resilience and the life and the joy that it should bring. These battles cause us just to give up, to retreat, to down tools. Sanballat and Tobiah talked the Jews down, but their trash talk was all lies. It was all lies. And what God wants for us, his people, is for us to hear the truth and for it to build us up. And what I mean by truth that builds us up is things like, say, Jackie, your ceaseless energy is an inspiration to the rest of us. It is, isn't it? Isn't that true?
Yes.
Chris, your your imagination, it opens up futures that are beyond our current horizons. That's right. I don't know how many of you know Chris well enough to say yes.
Yes.
That's true. Ori and Hannah, your obedience in moving to Banbury, it tells us all that God has plans for our lives, paths of righteousness to walk in that will do us good, and we're encouraged.
Amen.
Now, I was tempted to go around as many people as I could and go on forever. John, your openness in sharing the gospel with other people, God's love for other people, inspires us and reminds us that the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone. It reminds us of that truth, and that builds us up. You know, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to invite you to take up the baton. I don't know quite how this works with masks. I'm sure we can do it appropriately. But I want to ask for an immediate and direct response this morning. Thank you very much. This afternoon. I can only do morning or evening. I can't do afternoon. By the way, Vic, I wanted to say, your leadership at work inspires us that God is King of Kings in all places. All places. It inspires others in other places to know that the same is true there. Thank you. I wanted to encourage you to start doing this to one another. No, well, I encourage, invite, tell you, do it! In these minutes that we have now, with masks as you need to, can we take a few minutes to encourage one another? To do the opposite of Sanballat. Sanballat and Tobiah talked the people of God down, shamed, threatened, wearied them. We have the power this morning to speak the truth to one another concerning each other in ways that will build us up, give us honour in place of shame, strength in place of weariness, and courage instead of fear. We have the power to do that, and there's a moment that we can do it right now. So I'm just going to allow for a moment's quiet and then invite you to go and start talking to one another. And I think we're going to get called back together somehow at some point. I don't know how it's going to happen, but there's scope here to win some battles.